not always sort of what you know, but a lot of times it's who you know. And ISACA has given me the ability to network with folks and form those bonds and those connections with folks professionally to solve just about any problem that could come up.
The certifications with the conferences that they have are so good. For us, it has worked out where whenever we've needed any information related to something about how to do this or what's a better way of doing it, we've always turned to them, and then that's the value to us.
So often people come to me as a resource, so I use a lot of that research that's already out in the ISACA world and bring that in and leverage it.
And ISACA helps you learn about the latest information, and I've seen where it's definitely helped me get to where I'm at today.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Tuganov. I'm president of ISACA Astana chapter. First of all, Happy New Year. Thank you that you have time to join today's session. For those who didn't join, so we will record the session, so you will be able to look at your time. So I'm glad to announce that ISACA Astana, we started this year new program called IT Talks, and we're glad to have a speaker, Mark Thomas, today, who will provide a session related COBIT5 and intersecting with IT in audit. So Mark, I will pass screen to you.
Oh, very good. Okay, thanks for having me. And while we're setting this thing up, I think I just hit share screen so everybody can see my presentation. All right. Give me just a second to set this up, and you guys should be able to see my screen now. Is that correct? Can you guys see the cover slide?
Yep.
Okay, great. Excellent. Thanks for joining, everyone, and I appreciate it. I'm talking to you from the state of Kansas in the USA. It's a little cold here, but I don't think it's as cold as where you are. I think it's -4 here. I think you probably, for a lot of you guys, it's a little bit colder. But hey, I wanted to tell you just a little bit of background on this presentation. I'm pretty excited to talk to you about this. This presentation is a result of some personal experiences that I had in an organization as a CIO of this organization. And one of the things that we had found was we didn't have a controlling framework to help us out. We suffered from what I call framework overload. We had frameworks everywhere in my organization, and we didn't have a good foundational governing framework to help us with those things. And that's how we found COBIT. And it really was focused initially on how we looked at IT services as well as our processes and how we audited those. So this presentation was given at ISACA in Dubai last month, and it was a very great conversation, and so we thought we'd share this with you guys today. So I'm going to go ahead and start my video so you don't have that in the way from you, but let's just jump in and then see what some of the things we're going to talk about today. So here are the topics. So we're going to go through a quick introduction. I think before we go into the specifics of COBIT and the auditing stuff, it's good to talk a little bit about governance of enterprise IT. We'll go into a quick COBIT overview, talk about assurance, and then the intersection of COBIT and assurance and how we were able to take this framework, specifically COBIT5, and not only help us with our assurance and audit efforts, but it helped us align the entire organization, and it was absolutely gorgeous how it happened. We'll do closing and time for some questions if you guys have questions at the end. One of the things that I wanted to do is just make sure you get a little background on me. I am COBIT C-Risk certified, also been in the COBIT world for quite a long time, as well as an ITIL expert. But here's where this all started with, that got to this presentation. I was a CIO of an organization. We were a managed service provider. We provided IT services, an outsourcer, if you will, for the mid-sized market. Well, what was happening was we were doing awesome at cybersecurity. In fact, we passed all of our audits. We were solid when it came to our security practices. But we were sitting in an executive conference and my CEO slaps his hand on the table and he says, why is it that we're going out of business as the most secured company in the world? Let that sink in for a minute, because we were passing all of our audits, but we were failing as a business. We had customers that were leaving us because of poor services. We had multiple areas of downtime. We had capacity issues, but we were still passing audits. And that was the big gap that we had, because every one of our chiefs, we weren't talking to each other. Our audit team was auditing just cybersecurity because it was strictly focused on compliance only. It wasn't focused on business goals, business objectives, and being able to provide value for our stakeholders. So that was interesting. The chief risk officer was just looking at financial risk. They weren't looking at the effects of IT risk and how those affected us. And IT, I'm focused on IT processes. So all of us are looking at different things, and we had to have some glue that put us together. So that's going to be the story I'm going to use throughout this presentation to help you understand why we're saying there's an intersection between COBIT and assurance. And I'm going to put some other things in there for you as well that will be helpful. So what this presentation is not, this is not a presentation that teaches you how to audit. It's not a presentation that's going to turn you into an IT expert or a COBIT expert. What we're doing here is really trying to understand what applicable products are out there in the COBIT5 world, how you take a value-based approach to an assurance strategy so that you have a holistic look at audit and assurance and not just on compliance only, and then look at this balancing of performing as a business and conforming when it comes to rules, regulations, and policies. And so those are the objectives of what we're going to talk about here. So let's just jump on in. We're going to first start with what we call governance of enterprise IT. Now, I like this topic because as an organization, we have to understand there's a separation of governance and management. And what we find, and I found this happening to me, was my board of directors would say, IT, govern yourselves. Now, think about that. If you tell me to govern myself, what you've just done is ask me to make up my own rules, determine which of my own rules I want to follow, and determine the consequences on those rules I choose to break. So that's not really governing me. The separation here says on the governance side, we have to provide policy and direction. And then on the management side, where I can now plan, build, run, and monitor those practices and activities that are required to be able to do that. So here's the primary thing we looked at when we started to look at this holistic approach. We said, look, every organization has to create value and provide value for the enterprise. And we had to first understand that as subunits of this company, we were all service providers. IT, I'm a service provider to the enterprise. Audit, they're a service provider to the enterprise. Risk is a service provider. And what is it that we need to be able to do to ensure that we're all marching down the same path? Well, what we say is in order to create value, we need to understand the goals. And I'm going to talk to you about how we use this thing called the goals cascade to do that. But when we look at that, the three ingredients to creating value as a part of your governance program is benefits realization, which means, are we doing the things that we said we do, and are we creating the value and the benefits we said we would? Risk optimization is, are we allowing the enterprise to make informed decisions based on the risk appetite and the thresholds that are given us from our governing bodies? And risk optimization, are we using our resources wisely, our people, money, our services, infrastructure applications, and most importantly, information? It was interesting when my CEO, when we talked about things like benefits, risk, and resource, he always asked three questions, particularly around risk. He would say, what is the risk to my information, right? And because information was a very, very important asset for us as well as a resource. The second question was, what's the risk to our people? people being harmed, those types of things. And the third thing he would ask is, what's the risk of me making it on the front page of the newspaper? Branding risk. So those are the three things that he looked at because those are important for him. But when you think about governance, what happens is now you start looking at this thing called framework overload. And this is what we had. So I want to tell you about this picture for a second, because there are different altitudes of frameworks and of activities that you have. The first thing I want to tell you is this is a good piece of advice for anybody is wherever you are in an organization, there will always be a governing body of some type above you. There should be. That's the separation of governance and management. But this picture that you're looking at is very, very similar to the picture we had in our organization as we first were trying to determine what the frameworks looked like. Now, if you look at this up at the top, what are the drivers? Well, as an organization, I need to balance performance and conformance, right? I need to perform as an organization. I need to hit those areas in my balance scorecard that you see below that. Balance scorecard, things like financial metrics, people metrics, right? Those are the types of things we looked at. But we had to make sure that we were balancing that with conformance, things like Sarbanes-Oxley here in North America, GDPR, which is coming up, and those legal and regulatory kinds of concerns. Where we were unbalanced was we were so heavy on the right-hand side that was conformance that our performance suffered because of that. And this caused my CEO to say, why are we going out of business? Now, we weren't really going out of business, but our business metrics were failing. But how is it that we can pass audits? That was the big thing. So you see there's the Committee of Sponsoring Organization, or COSO, at the enterprise level, at the board level. That was the framework that was used to look at conformance at the enterprise level. Now, you look at governance of enterprise IT, where you see COBIT. For just a minute, pull that box that says COBIT out. Pretend that box is not there. And then you go down to standards and good practices. And the standards and good practices where we were overwhelmed. We had so many things out there. I was initially what I called myself an ITIL organization, formerly known as the IT Infrastructure Library. So everybody said ITIL, ITIL, ITIL. And then I look over at my project and program team. They're saying Prince 2, PMBOK, PMBOK. And so we have people saying, oh, not just that, we have things called TOGAF. I have things called, there's something out there that called COBIT, but we really haven't looked at it. We've got Six Sigma. You see, the idea was we were overwhelmed at the standards and good practices level. And everybody said, pick one. Well, what we found was that missing link right there in the middle, which says governance of enterprise IT, COBIT. This sounds a little bit redundant, but COBIT became the framework to manage frameworks for us. It was the glue. If you think about what middleware does, what does middleware do? Middleware helps you connect applications and information that normally don't talk to each other. And so that's what COBIT allowed us to do. So this was the first step to us, making sure that everybody in the organization at least had a common way to look at how we were going to govern across the enterprise. So I think that's a great way to kind of kick this piece off. Now, if you look at the bottom two gray bars, it says standards and good practices. Just picture those bottom two bars, and that's going to take us into this next slide, which really gives you kind of a look at the overload of things that we had that we were starting to bring in. Now, those bottom two slides, standards and good practices. Now, the information you see here, this was based on my personal information. This is not from a COBIT document or anything like that. What we did was we took every one of our standards and frameworks and put them into different categories. So we knew which frameworks were out there. Now, this not only helped me in IT, but it helped us in audit. So we could now look at the different categories or different areas where we may have high value assets, where we may have information vulnerabilities and those types of things. So from governance to architecture, service management, program project, risk, security, quality, and then of course, life cycles, things like the SDLC and our Agile, we had Agile teams moving on. So you can see that this becomes extremely overwhelming, but we didn't know which parts of which framework we should use. Security, for example, we had two camps, right? We had one part of our organization that said ISO 27000 series, and another part that said, no, use this thing called NIST 800-53, or the latest, the NIST cybersecurity framework. Well, you see now where we started seeing some portions of COBIT jump in there. But how do I know which of these frameworks and which parts of these are most applicable to me. That's what COBIT helped us do. So you start to see the foundations of these different parts of my organization now saying, okay, we see the larger picture to this. So this is what we had to do, is make sure we understood the separation of governance and management and understand what our framework architecture looked like first. So now that we've talked a little bit about the governance side, let's go in and I'll tell you just a little bit of background on COBIT. I'm not assuming you know COBIT. I'm not assuming you don't know. I'm just going to give you kind of an overview of what this thing is. So I love this picture. This right here describes what we felt like when we finally figured out how COBIT could help us. Now, it says, I finally found the right IT framework. It doesn't say the only IT framework. You saw before, we had multiple frameworks out there. But you notice, look at these kits and cages and tools and lights and switches everywhere. COBIT now let us take all these little parts and pieces and put them into one specific view of how we were going to govern and manage enterprise IT and how we audited that information. So today, COBIT's the only end-to-end business framework that really gives me a end-to-end look and integrated view of what we call governance of enterprise IT. I'll tell you a little bit about the history on this in just a little bit. This was really cool because now everybody used it. And you can take the word IT out of this framework and still is a good governance model for anybody in your organization. It really helps you look at information. It helps you focus on strategic goals. Everything we do now in my organization is focused on goals and stakeholder needs. But it also helps me with that compliance. Remember, we talked about that balance of performance and conformance, and it helped us make informed decisions about IT-related risk, and now we can optimize our services because remember, we're all service providers in this organization. So COBIT. So when I love to ask people, what does COBIT stand for? And most people say control objectives for IT. Well, it was really control objectives for information and related technologies. Today, COBIT just stands for COBIT. Now, the history on this was back in 1996. We needed a way to audit, to help audit information and audit IT systems. And that's what was basically COBIT-1. So if you think about that as kind of a checklist, but we figured out that you really can't just go in and audit using a checklist. You need to have control objectives. That's where we start seeing the evolution of a control objective into 1998 into COBIT number 2. A control objective says, we're not going to come and just audit this specific thing. We're going to give you a range. We're going to say, are you meeting this objective? And therefore, you can determine the level of response that you need to put in place for that. We roll into 2000, COBIT-3. Now we have management involved, where we now have metrics and measurements, things like that involved. And then IT governance in 2005. Now, what happened was we started to see a lot of other documents that started to pop up. Now, these are not relevant what they are to us in this presentation, but we saw this guide called COBIT-4. And then later COBIT-4.1. But additional guides started to pop up, but they really did not link back into the COBIT framework very well. So one of the reasons why we went to COBIT-5 was to make what we call a single integrated framework. And that was when COBIT-5 came out in 2012, and that's the version that we're on today. And when COBIT-5 came out, a lot of things became clear because it now looked holistically across the enterprise. And I'll explain to you here in just a couple seconds what I mean by holistically. So COBIT basically at a very high level, it's really based on what we call principles and enablers. I'll just give you a quick update on these. So the principles of this were basically, hey, we need to meet stakeholder needs, meet goals and objectives. We need to cover the enterprise end to end, that single integrated framework where we brought a bunch of older ISACA documents into this framework as well. And this is great. Under principle number 3 is we brought in and we referenced the industry standards, industry frameworks, bodies of knowledge that COBIT now links to. This is how we made that middleware. A holistic approach, which is what we call enablers next. And then of course, the separation of governance and management. Let me tell you about these enablers. These enablers, this was it for me. This now looked at the ingredients I had to have in my enterprise for a holistic view, which if you think about these enablers are basically principle number 4. Principles, policies, and frameworks. What policies do I have? Are they in line with my principles? And do I have a framework that allows me to change and modify policies and know what other policies are affected by that? Processes. We'll look at processes in a few minutes. There's 37 processes in the COBIT framework. Organizational structures. This is not just the org chart. This is defining the levels of authority, the delegations of responsibility, the span of control. So this is now in culture, in organizational structures, is how we determine who can make what decisions and how do we delegate those rights. The number one silent killer to any one of these is what's called culture, ethics, and behavior. Because we may be changing our culture or we may be trying to change behaviors. And what is our attitude towards things like risk taking and those things? Information is an asset to me. It's also a resource for me. And information has a life cycle, and that's what we're trying to make sure that we're protect, and we're trying to be good stewards of that information. Services, infrastructure, and applications. Remember, as a service provider, I provide you services, and I have to do that with things that plug into the wall by infrastructure, the applications that support those, and then finally, the people, the skills, and the competencies that we have in place to be able to do those things. So remember those enablers. You're going to see those things come up when we talk about how we intersected IT and audit, okay? One of the things I told you about, a very powerful tool for us, was called the goals cascade. This was awesome. If you look into the COBIT documents, you will see there are a set of tables that are there for you that actually walk you through a generic set of stakeholder needs, how they map to enterprise goals, how they map to IT-related goals, and how they map to enabler goals. And one of the things specifically that COBIT does, it maps down to processes. So if I told you, if you were my executive committee, and I said, hey, I need additional funding for tools and for an upgrade of our change management process. And you ask me, well, how do you know that change management is important? I could actually link that process to IT goals, to enterprise goals, to stakeholder needs. So what this thing does, it takes these stakeholder needs and translates those all the way down into specific goals at the enabler level. Remember those 7 enablers that we talked about. This is important because this now allows me to determine the level of implementation for things like processes, improvement for processes, and here we go. It helps me look at the assurance efforts. So now what this goals cascade did is it said, hey, IT, here are the things I'm focusing on because they're important to the organization. Now, of course, cybersecurity was part of that. But now my internal audit team could also do the same thing and do their annual audit scoping based on the same goals cascade that I'm doing. If you cannot lose, if the things you do support the goals of your higher level entities. That's why this is a very, very huge thing. I'll bring this back to you here in just a little bit for you as well. One of the things we talked about was the single integrated framework. These are the documents and guides in COBIT. You notice up at the top, we have COBIT5. That's the core document that explains the principles, the enablers, and it also has the goals cascade. Remember, we had 7 enablers. Now today, there are 2 guides for those enablers. One is enabling processes, and one is enabling information. Then we have professional guides, implementation, information security, COBIT5 for assurance that we'll talk about in this course just in a little bit. Of course, COBIT5 for risk, one of my personal favorites as well. So this shows us that COBIT is not just one document. There are several documents that give you some more detailed advice over different areas that you need to be able to provide value for the enterprise. Wow, this is a busy slide, but these are the processes. You may have seen these before, 37 processes in 5 domains. Notice the first domain way over on the left, that's my governance domain. We've separated governance from management. There's 5 processes sitting in the governance domain, 32 sitting over here in management. So you might say, well, I don't see any business processes in there. You told me this was a business framework. Well, these are the IT-related processes required to govern and manage information that the business produces, requires, and needs to conduct its business. So you notice these things say, for example, we talked about change management earlier. That's over in the build, acquire, and implement domain. BAI6, manage changes. So that gives you at least a high level look at what the processes are. Now, what each of these processes, what we've done in COBIT is taken each one and we've broken each of these processes down into more detailed guidance. Remember we talked earlier, the previous slide, we said we've got this guide here called the Enabling Process Guide. You see it right there in that second, in the second white box. It says COBIT5 Enabling Processes. It takes each one of these processes and it breaks it down and tells you the process identification description, gives you a purpose statement, and it tells you how that process supports those generic goals that we talked about in the goals cascade. Gives you goals and metrics, gives you ratio charts. But here's what's nice. The last two pieces are what we really liked, is it gave us detailed practice descriptions. Every process is broken down into what we call practices and activities. And these are what we used to call control objectives. So for example, BAI6, manage changes. If you looked up that in the process guide, it would give you some practices saying, here are what we used to call control objectives. Here are the things this process needs to complete. And here are the activities that support that. Now, this helped me in IT focus on, hey, those are the controls that I need to have in place for the process. And now Audit can do the same thing. We're now starting to look at the same areas. But here's what's really cool. That last box on the bottom right says related guidance. That tells me that COBIT says, hey, we can't tell you everything. We're going to tell you what you need to accomplish. But if you need more detailed information, here is the framework or the standards you run to. So for example, manage changes. COBIT told us the things we had to accomplish, but it didn't tell me how to do every one of them. It would say, oh, you want more information on this process? Go to ITIL, go to ISO 20000, right? They'll give you more information there that you need. This is absolutely huge because now that allowed us to look at the processes holistically across the organization. Pretty good stuff. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background on COBIT, and I know it was a crash course, but we want to talk about assurance next, and then we'll talk about, of course, how we leverage the two together. So what is assurance after all? A lot of people use audit and assurance kind of in the same sentence, but really assurance is saying that, hey, we need to have an accountability relationship between two or more parties. We'll talk about those parties. IT, audit, and assurance, they may be engaged to help give their feedback, their written communication, saying that, hey, the accountable party is or is not controlling these practices the way we're supposed to be doing. And when I say supposed to be doing, it's not just laws, regulations, and compliance. It's also internal policies and internal practice compliance. So that's what assurance is doing for us, is giving me feedback on how well I'm complying to internal and external, as well as policies, procedures, and so on. So why do we have drivers for this? Well, making sure that we have substantiated opinions on how well I'm meeting my objectives. It's basically making sure that I'm in line with enterprise objectives. Aha! I'm no longer just focusing on external compliance. It's enterprise objectives. And then, of course, am I satisfying those regulatory and contractual requirements that I have to have in place? So we have to have assurance. Now, assurance is not, this is not like doing a process assessment, right? A process assessment says, hey, how well is this process behaving? What assurance does is said, how well is this being controlled based on some factors that we have? So we have this guide that we had called COBIT5 for Assurance. Remember, that was one of the professional guides we saw in the single integrated framework. It is based on COBIT enablers. This is a huge point for you because remember, I said there are 7 enablers, and after this presentation, you may have to go back and refresh yourself on those enablers. But we're no longer just focusing on a process. We're no longer focusing on 5 processes. We're looking holistically. We're looking at policies. We're looking at organizational structures. We're looking at processes. We're looking at services, infrastructure, application, across that whole spectrum of all those things we need to actually accomplish. That's why this thing is huge. We do have a 3-party relationship that I mentioned earlier. So basically that relationship, and this schematic comes right out of the assurance guide that we just saw a second ago. You have an assurance professional, that's going to be, in some cases, my auditor. The accountable party, that's me as the IT service provider. Then, of course, the user, somebody who is using or consuming that service. So the things you see on the audit process, we basically audit using 3 basic phases. We determine the scope, we understand the subject matter, and we actually assess, and then we communicate that information back. I'll show you that in a little bit more detail a little bit later. But how do we bring COBIT5 into this entire assurance effort? This is what we have right here in the middle. Notice, when we are looking at assurance, I'm not just saying focus on one area. This was huge, because what we had done in our company is, you look at the COBIT5 enablers that has processes. We had one process in there that was managed security services, and that's all we audited. Now we say we've got a much broader spectrum to look at, and are we ensuring that we have a balanced approach to how we're auditing? So the assurance function says, hey, what do we need in place to be able to audit these enablers? And the assessment perspective says, basically, how do we make sure that we have the process to do that? So the function says the organizational, the assessment perspective says, how do we actually look at the audit itself? So again, this picture is also inside of the assurance guide, but I just wanted to kind of touch those pieces, because what we've just done is we've gone from, in my organization, from audit, only auditing checklist items around security, to a whole new world of how we need now look at assurance efforts. One of the things that we had to recognize was that as an IT service provider, I am what we consider the first line of defense. Because what was happening is, and I agreed with the pushback on this. So there were people that said, well, audit, how is this happening? And audit says, hang on a second, we're third line of defense. If audit catches something, it's gone through 2 lines of defense, and that's too late to catch it at some point. So we understood that as a service provider, IT and operations, I am first line of defense. So I need to make sure that I have accountability and responsibility of controlling the actions that we have. Because if we're expecting audit as the third line of defense to catch something and we blame them for something, that's like blaming the goalie for losing the soccer match. So the first thing is, we had to understand that these lines of defense, again, audit is not there as a operational kind of role to catch these things. We don't want audit to catch stuff, because that means we're doing our jobs at the first 2 lines of defense. Now, one of the things you see here, you see this thing called a risk function or enterprise risk group. Now, we could not, in our organization, we can't make decisions without looking at appropriate risk. Because what is risk? Risk is, how do we make informed decisions? So another guide we use that we brought in was called COBIT5 for risk. I'm going to share something with you really cool here in just a second. They help us scope these items. And guidance on managing risk. So this is similar to like the assurance guide we just talked about, but it's a full guide that talks about the risk process, right? We have risk governance and we have risk management. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of those things as we scope our audits here in a second. But what this COBIT5 for risk guide did, it opened up our eyes to something called risk scenarios. Okay, so a scenario is an event. So a lot of people confuse a risk, a threat, and a vulnerability. A risk is something that could happen that could have a material effect on my business objectives not being met. A threat is that object or that person that can make it happen. And then, of course, a vulnerability is that weakness that I have that they're trying to exploit to harm my business goals. So we came up with a list of what we call risk scenarios. And I'll show you a couple of those here in a minute. But in the COBIT5 for risk guide, it has a set of over 100 generic risk scenarios broken down into categories that we can now use. You see what we're doing? Now what we're doing is saying, hey, we know cybersecurity is one risk, but we have other areas of risk as well. So we go into what we call risk response, of course. Again, this is a very busy slide, but you look at this box that says risk response options. So we look at our scenarios, we analyze those scenarios, and then we have 4 options. Right? We can avoid the risk, we can share or transfer that, we can accept it, or we can mitigate it. When we do that, when we mitigate, we're now putting controls in place that will reduce my vulnerability, reduce the likelihood that risk could happen, or reduce the amount of pain I'm going to have if that risk becomes real. So those controls we put in place, right, they are now trying to remove or reduce the threat. So if you look at the top, these are types of controls that we're looking at. We may have a threat that could create an attack. That attack is exploiting my vulnerability, which causes business impact. You notice it doesn't say cybersecurity only on here. It could be any threat. It could be a tornado here if you're in the Midwest, right? It could be an ice storm, or it could be a distributed denial of service attack. But we have to determine the types of controls that are most appropriate for this. Because remember, if we go and say we have to be overly compliant on all these controls, we're spending all of our time, effort, and money in the wrong place when we may only have to have a deterrent control in place. A deterrent control reduces the likelihood of that attack. Deterrent control is like a sign that says, do not enter, okay? A detective control is a motion detector light that comes on. It could trigger a preventative control that keeps something from happening, okay? So the whole idea here is don't just look at being overly compliant on everything, because if you had preventative controls everywhere, when you could have a deterrent or a detective control, you may be spending all of your time, effort, and money in the wrong areas. So what you're looking at here is just an example of where we looked at risk scenarios. So we looked at these scenarios and we said, okay, there are over 100 scenarios that we had, but we had to get these things down into a manageable set. Now, these are pretty high level scenarios here, but the point I want to illustrate to you is we looked at every one of these scenarios and we gave it a ranking. We looked at severity and we looked at likelihood. You see that right there. And it was just pretty basic, low, medium, and high for severity, unlikely all the way to very likely. We gave it a risk ranking, and that allowed us to now look at those high ranked risks that we needed to focus on in the organization. And you notice one of the things we did in you see the little pie chart types of things, what those did is allowed us to now say, okay, if that risk becomes real, what is the effect on us meeting our goals? Now, if you look at the blue boxes on the top, those were our high-level business goals. Again, that's just the titles only of them. But what we can now do is look at the level of impact that risk scenario is going to have on my meeting goals. Now I can determine which of those scenarios we need to have stronger or more controls against. And that is where we focused our audits. This all, folks, is coming out of the COBIT framework that's putting these pieces together so that we can now make decisions on the areas that we need to look at focusing on. So let's talk about this intersection of COBIT and assurance, right? We've talked a little bit about COBIT, we've talked about assurance, now kind of how these things came together. So there are a couple of things, out here that COBIT does have a relationship. It's umbrella guidance over making sure that I can look at IT assurance. But there are other areas and other resources out there. You have what's called ITAF. We have the internal auditors standards, and of course, AICPA standards. Most of these will be North American, and I would assume if you're in audit, you've heard a couple of these things. But it's just showing you that COBIT is not a standalone audit document. It references other auditing types of documents out there. And if you're looking for some great information on some additional guidance for auditing when you're dealing with COBIT, there are several guides out there. And as ISACA members, many of these things are free and some of them are paid. But here's one of the things you can see on the top left where we have where it says build, acquire, and implement. For every single process in that COBIT reference model, there is an auditing or assurance guide for you. Go out to the ISACA site, ISACA.org, and you can go to the COBIT area, and it has one of these guides for every single one. Notice the example you see here is BAI6, Manage Changes. There's also one called Vendor Management, which I really like a lot. It talks a lot about controls, possible risk scenarios and controls for vendor management. Of course, controls and assurance in the cloud. A pretty recent document out there was the Audit and Assurance Program for Cybersecurity based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. And then, of course, there's one for Sarbanes-Oxley. There are several others out there. These are some of the key documents that help you look at setting up your audit based on COBIT. Because remember, COBIT knows that we can't give you everything. Other standards and other frameworks are applicable out there for you as well. Here is the huge part. Now what we do is we don't just look at regulatory compliance. If you look at this guide, my organization, if you look, when we looked at our focus areas for audit, we only looked at that last piece that says regulatory and compliance. That's all we focused on. But now what we've got a couple of other dimensions or a couple other viewpoints to help us look at our priorities. One was goals cascading. Remember I told you that's that cascade that maps stakeholder needs to enterprise goals to IT goals to specific processes that I have to have in place. That allowed me to have a list of areas that we need to focus on. It gives me risk scenarios. Now I've got those generic scenarios that I can put into specific scenarios and determine those specific risks that could take place and where I needed to focus my IT and audit efforts. It gives us pain points. What are those areas that are harming us and hurting us, and what are the processes in place? And finally, regulatory and compliance. This gave us a balanced approach to how we now scoped my efforts in IT, and it aligned that with how audit's now looking at this. Now we can find that it wasn't cybersecurity that was our biggest risk. It was service level agreements and relationship management. That's where we were having our biggest problems. This picture right here, hopefully turns on some light bulbs for you and says, hey, we don't just focus on one or two things. We focus on several areas to give us what's important to the business. Now, when we look at that information, of course, this is very busy. I won't spend much time on this, but basically what this says is once we determine those hot spots based on those 4 dimensions, remember those 4 dimensions right here, goals, risks, pain points, and our regulatory issues. Now we look at the enablers that support that. Remember, there are 7 enablers. So you see, this thing can get complex, but if you focus on what's important, it helps you go all the way down to these 4 questions. Are stakeholder needs addressed? Are enabler goals achieved? Are we managing the life cycle? And are we applying these good practices? This information helps us in audit scope that. Now, COBIT also has some processes that help us audit. Remember, and again, we won't cover all the details on this, but if you look at, remember that process reference model that I showed you with all the 37 processes in their 5 domains. The last domain was called monitor, evaluate, and assess. There were 3 processes in there. These are the processes. Now, these are the auditing or the assurance processes. The first one, MEA1, monitor, evaluate, and assess performance and conformance. Here it is. Are we looking at the balance between performance, right, meeting business goals, and conformance, meeting those regulatory types of concerns and conformance requirements that we have? The second process is my internal control. This is internal audit. My third process is, are we complying with external requirements? Again, we don't want to say that that's not important. What I want to say is that there's more things important to us than just external compliance, because if we're out of business, who cares if we were compliant? So, the COBIT reference model, as well as the process guide that is out there, gives information on how you set up the processes for auditing. Now, that is very cool. So how do we actually look at this audit, and what are the steps we go through? Well, also in this guide, basically, I told you there were 3 phases to this audit or the assurance. Basically, in phase A, we understand, who it is that the stakeholders are, what our objectives are. We go to phase B, we look at the assessment criteria and we assess. In phase C, we communicate that information out. All this is in the COBIT for Assurance Guide, and it links back to, surprise, surprise, all of my enablers. So that first step, understanding the stakeholders, again, this is great information. Who are the interested parties? And who's going to get the report of this? You'll see here I put a comment that COBIT has a summary description of a complete set of roles that you can have as a starting point, and I put in there where you can actually find that information. The next step we have is, what are our assurance objectives? What do we want to accomplish in this? So look at this. We look at the enterprise strategy and priorities. We understand the internal context, the external context. Guess what these are? These are those 4 dimensions that I mentioned before. We look at our goals cascade, we look at our risks, we look at our pain points, we look at where our compliance requirements are. I will tell you the best place to start is look at that goals cascade, because like I said before, now we can look, and you can too, you can focus assurance efforts against what's important to the enterprise. And then we determine the enablers in scope. What are the enablers out there we're looking at? So remember those 7 categories. These are the same things we saw a few slides ago. Are we looking at just policies, processes, organizational structures, or all of them? Because let's say I pick out a process that I'm auditing, and that process is BAI6 managed changes. That would be the second bullet point. We picked one process, but we don't just look at that process. Now we look at the policies that are affected, that affect that process. We're looking at the organizational structures for that process, like the decision criteria. We're looking at the behaviors and the information. What services did that process touch? And do we have the right people, skills, and competencies? So that's just looking at it from a process viewpoint. If we're going through picking out a policy that we need to audit, well, if we're looking at a single policy, what processes does that policy affect? What organizational structures does it affect? And so on. This is where it gets really, really deep. But if you look at it from specifically from a goals cascade perspective, you can pick out the specific areas to take a look at. Of course, the next step is you set your suitable assessment criteria. Now people say, well, where's my checklist? Okay. Well, if you're looking at processes, you've got control objectives right there in COBIT for you. All right, if you're looking at services, infrastructure, and applications, you may have specific auditing areas you need to look at for infrastructure and applications, like if you're auditing a Unix environment, right? That's where you get that specific auditing information from that specific Unix area, because COBIT doesn't tell you that how to audit a Unix environment. So that's where it's really big, because it was that glue that held all these pieces together. So you have your assessment criteria, and then you go through you actually assessing the enablers. This is the actual audit itself. Again, this is just very high level on what an audit does. And again, not to try to tell you how to audit, but basically 5 steps. You inquire and confirm, right? You get your expectations set up, start your interviews. You go through your inspection of your policies, your any documentation, information, all right, those types of things. You do any observations, any reperformance or recalculation of that, and then you review the evidence. So that's just at high level on what the actual audit process is, because what we're auditing are those enablers from COBIT5. And then we have the last step, document and communicate. Where are the gaps, right? And any findings we have to have. Now, here's what's important. In IT, what happens now is we go through, do this audit. And my internal audit says, here are all the areas that have certain findings. That doesn't mean that IT stops what it's doing and has to remedy every one of those audit findings. What we looked at was what is our capacity? What is the business case? And what areas has COBIT told me and my enterprise told me is important for me to focus on? So those findings, we might say, we choose as an enterprise to accept that risk. Or we may choose to mitigate that risk. And in that case, we look back and say, well, what are those controls we can put in place to mitigate? Do we have a detective control, which is pretty cheap, or do we put a preventative control that's pretty expensive, or we do a series of several controls? That's where this stuff all comes together and it intersects, because like I've been saying several times, and what I want you to walk out of this with is that we don't just focus on one area. What we've just seen is we have a holistic look to how we put this together. So this took us several months to put this information together and look at how we really viewed assurance in the enterprise. So we no longer had to say we're going out of business as the most secure company in the world. We found that when we focused our IT efforts and our assurance and audit efforts along the same benefits, we now focus on those areas that made the most sense to the business. And we were allowed to look at what those areas were that helped us succeed as an organization. So I know I want to make sure that we have some time for questions for you guys out there, but some things to think about. Things to think about, because again, we went through a very, very fast course on COBIT and assurance and how we squeeze those things together. But I want you to think about a couple of things. What areas can be leveraged by your organization today to help you in assurance? I'll answer the question for you, and then I want you to think through this. How do you incorporate a goals cascade and make sure everybody is marching towards the same goals? How do you look at creating risk scenarios at the enterprise level, linking those to IT risks, so we now are marching down the same path? And how can we now balance those with our conformance, with our actual audits? How can the COBIT enablers assist in providing a more holistic approach to the governance and management of enterprise IT? Remember those 7 enablers. Those are ingredients to your success. And that was the biggest aha moment for me, is now I'm not just looking at processes, I'm looking at 6 other enablers as well. Because if I just focus on one enabler, something else is going to affect it that we had no idea it's even taking place. Finally, then I'll let you guys think about this one, but what are the most compelling messages you want to take back to work following the things we're talking about here? So let that kind of think about those a little bit, because there's a lot of things you can do. Of course, you could go get some COBIT training, those kinds of things out there. There's a lot of great stuff to get out there. You can go to like a COBIT Foundation. There are some video series out there. There's a lot of stuff you can look at. But what I wanted to do is at least break this down for you so that you kind of understood the key components, because most people say there's a lot of documents in this COBIT. I'm not sure where to look for what. So hopefully I've given you, at least from a perspective of intersecting IT and audit, I've given you a little perspective of how to look at balancing an enterprise view of how you might want to do this. So that finishes up. I know we have an hour to do this, but I want to make sure we had a few minutes at the end for you guys to ask some questions. And again, this will be recorded because we went kind of quick. You may want to go back and take a look at some of these areas as well. So I'm open for questions. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to talk through those right now.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can.
Yes, hi. My name is Mary. Thank you very much for a very informative and interesting presentation.
You're welcome.
We're all talking about the enterprise IT management and governance, but can you please define what is enterprise IT? What exactly it includes?
Yeah. So when you talk about enterprise IT, one of the things I think is important for you to focus on is who is the organization that provides services to the business, and that's what we're talking about, enterprise IT. Now, some of those portions may be outsourced. So I think the important thing here is from a principal standpoint is, if I provide a service to the enterprise that requires IT systems, IT applications, then I fall under this idea of an enterprise IT service provider. Now, it could have several layers. So for us, for example, I had 200 or more supported organizations that we supported. I ran corporate IT, enterprise IT. So in our organization, we supported services for the internal organization. I also supported services for every company that I was the IT. Remember, we were an outsourcer, so 200 companies out there. I was the CIO for 200 companies, plus my internal operations at our business. We classified ourselves as enterprise IT, anybody who worked under the jurisdiction of the organization that provides services. Now, when I say services, a lot of people confuse the difference between a service and an application or a piece of infrastructure. So a service, a service is hard to hold in its hand. One of our services was called financial transaction processing. Well, I can't go find transaction processing with a auto discovery tool, but I can find all the IT components. So once you understand what the service is, I think that's the best link, because a lot of people call enterprise IT different things, but I would tell you the test is, does that organization provide a service, a technically related service to another part of the organization? I would say it falls under the enterprise IT umbrella. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions out there? We've got a few more minutes, so just fire away if you have them. I can hang tight for a few more minutes.
Friday night, Mark.
That's right. That's okay. It's Friday morning here. I still have my whole day to go. So, okay. Well, with that, what I'll do is I'll turn it back to you guys, and